Hi, it's John and welcome to the video. Over the last couple of months, I've been pulling together an overview video of the Tamron 150 to 500mm lens. As part of that overview, I wanted to do a separate video looking at the autofocus capabilities, as I think that this is critical to the performance of any super telephoto lens. But overall, I'm really happy with the lens, and I'll be releasing a couple of future videos to cover my experience with it. Be sure to look out for those videos. I previously bought some telephoto lenses that I haven't been particularly happy with. I purchased a Panasonic Leica 100 to 400mm lens for my Micro Four Thirds system, and I also bought a Tamron 100 to 400 f-mount that I used on my Z mount cameras. While I think that these are optically quite good, I did struggle with the autofocus capabilities, which definitely led to some missed shots. So coming back to the Tamron 150 to 500 for the Z mount, I think we don't need to cover off on the sharpness of the lens, because the reviews over the last couple of years for the Sony and Fuji versions of this lens have shown the lens to be decently sharp, and further, decently sharp across the range of focal lengths. So when evaluating the autofocus capabilities, sharpness of the lens should not be a limiting factor. With all of that out of the way, let's get into evaluating the autofocus capabilities of the Tamron 150 to 500mm.
Let's spend a moment going over my general settings. So most of my testing has been with the lens attached to a Nikon Z8 body. The camera firmware is version 1.01 and the Tamron firmware is version 1. The autofocus is set to continuous autofocus with custom setting A1, AFC priority set to release priority. I kept custom setting A3 block shot AF response at its default at 3, as I didn't anticipate anything temporarily blocking my targets. For most scenes, I used AF area mode wide area with hybrid handoff to 3D tracking. I use this rather than auto area as it helps the camera ignore unwanted targets in busy scenes. I did switch to auto area in the soccer scenes later in the video as there were a limited number of targets. I set VR to on for pretty much all of my testing, though I think sport may be a better option for fast moving subjects, especially in video. That said, at high shutter speeds, it's more about stabilising the viewfinder than actually preventing camera shake on a stills image. I shot in JPEG for almost everything, but opted for RAW and JPEG for the skiing sequences, in case I messed up the exposure. I didn't do a bad job as I was able to tweak my exposures after a few underexposed sequences, and never used the RAW files. I mainly shot 20 frames per second, but dabbled with higher JPEG rates on a couple of outings. For the baseball pictures, I attempted to see if I could nail the point of impact between bat and ball. And for the indoor soccer scenes, I used C30 and C60.
Though note that C60 will give you a DX crop.
When I show my testing sequences, I'll note my exposure settings and the frame rates. While I think the included sequences support my analysis, do note that I've excluded sequences where I missed focus due to my own incompetence, as I don't consider them instructive. So let's go down to the Hudson River. This is a great spot to start a test as it's right next to where I live and it has a variety of interesting potential subjects. There are always cars, bikes and sometimes interesting birds. So my first subject was some Canada geese. I shot a few pictures which turned out okay, but they weren't the most animated. So I decided to head north up the bike path to shoot some cars coming down the West Side Highway. The camera and lens combo had no problem locking on and maintaining tracking on cars coming towards me at around 60 miles an hour. One compelling subject was a couple of guys on a moped whipping down the highway at highway speeds with no helmets. Traffic laws in New York City seem like suggestions much of the time. Okay, so highway traffic is pretty straightforward. So let's switch our attention to folks on bicycles. No problem here either. My next outing was taking my daughter to baseball practice. We have a weekend place in the town of Weston in Connecticut, and she takes lessons from a great local coach. This scene wasn't much of a challenge for the autofocus, as my daughter isn't moving around too much in the batting cage. It did give me the chance to play with the focus limiter switch, as the lens would often focus on the net of the batting cage. By setting the switch to 10 meters to infinity, it forced the lens to ignore the netting. Okay, for my next scenario, we visited Sherwood Island Beach on the Long Island Sound. It was a bright and sunny day with lots of contrast. I asked Dex to wander away and then come running towards me. I shot off a sequence of well over 200 files with pretty much all of them accurately in focus. With the Z8 and Tamron handling such scenes in their stride, I turned my hand to birds in flight. Having never shot such a subject, I thought, how hard can it be? Well, it seems you need some practice to get the critters nicely framed with the autofocus box placed right on them. As long as the bird stayed in the focus area, the camera and lens combo did a nice job. I lost focus as the bird drifted out of the wide focus area, and then it snaps back into focus when I frame the bird more centrally. I didn't get a chance to try the 3D tracking handoff on this sequence. Definitely work in progress on my part, but something to work from. Talking of photography genres I've never tried, how about World Cup slalom skiing, where the athletes are moving around 30 miles an hour and throwing themselves side to side between gates? So every year, the FIS Women's World Cup slalom circuit comes to Killington in Vermont. We were pretty excited to see these world-class athletes up close, and even more so as Michaela Schifrin would be racing. Back in March, Michaela broke the long-standing record of Ingemar Stenmark of 86 World Cup wins across all disciplines, so she's legendary. So let's get back to the photography. So here are my very first sequences from the comfort of the grandstand. It's clear the camera and lens are tracking the skiers, but given the depth of field at such a distance, that's hardly an impressive feat. I've made some tweaks to exposure and white balance on the camera-produced JPEGs, but overall the images are lightly edited and uncropped. In this sequence, I've moved closer to the hill, and the images are starting to look a little more interesting. I used the wide area AF area for all the skiing pictures. When I placed the autofocus box over the skier, the system frequently identified the skier as the subject. I did attempt some handheld video, but it was a bit of a bust. I think the sports VR setting may work better here, as the regular setting looks to hold onto the subject as long as it can, before it readjusts with a bit of a lurch. Also, less panning backwards and forth would make for a better video. So this sequence is poorly composed, but I do think it shows how well the focus locked onto the skier, even though there's a lot of foreground clutter in close proximity to the skier. In general, I feel pretty happy with my shots of the skiers, and I think my understanding of how to shoot them for a more dynamic look improved over the course of the morning. I'm also happy with the performance of the lens, which picked up and held focus nicely, and importantly, in a predictable manner. And by the way, Michaela won her 90th World Cup title that day. Epic. My next opportunity to use the big lens came when I received an automated text alert on my phone from the city of New York. These are typically information related to delayed buses and the like. Every now and then there's something more interesting. And on the 29th of November, a notice popped up that some fast jets will be making a flyby over the city. It was a lovely sunny but freezing morning. I did think of heading to the George Washington Bridge and shoot the planes heading up the river from the pedestrian walkway on the south side of the bridge, but it's currently closed for maintenance. So I decided to head to the boat basin at 79th Street, which has a jetty that goes out into the Hudson River by about 30 yards. This would give an uninterrupted view of the planes heading up the river, except for they never showed up. Somewhat dejectedly and very chilled, I took some sequences of some seagulls. But later that day, I received another notification. So the following day, I toddled off to the boat basin once again and happily shot some more sequences of seagulls as I patiently waited for the arrival of the hornets. While the weather was a good bit warmer, the sun at 1 p.m. was more over the river, so when the planes finally showed up, it was difficult to spot them. When I finally noticed them, I lined one of the planes up in the viewfinder and shot off a couple of bursts. While the camera and the lens did a nice job tracking the plane, the position of the planes with the strong backlighting of the bright sky resulted in some low contrast, low interest images. That said, there were no complaints with the performance of the camera and lens tracking focus. Next up, let's try the lens for indoor soccer or football, depending on your preference. My lad Dex loves his footy, and I often take advantage of his practices to refine my technique on shooting action. Usually I'd go with the 70-200 f2.8, which would be well suited to the task. But even then, the 70mm end can be too much when the action is right under your nose. But I wanted to see what limitations the 150-500 created in this scenario. I thought it would be way too long and slow, resulting in some nosebleed high ISO settings. The gym is pretty small, so I was generally stuck shooting at 150mm. But at least this gave me the lens's maximum aperture of f5. Keeping the shutter speed around 1/800th of a second meant ISOs of 16,000. And the ISO continued to creep up if I zoomed the lens in. The camera and lens combo had no problems tracking the activity, and I was surprised how usable the JPEGs were at those high ISOs, especially if I ensured that the shadows were adequately exposed. I also shot some video and did some heavy panning of Dex running back and forth. The lens and camera did a nice job of keeping in focus, though you can see a small amount of rolling shutter due to the speed of the panning. Obviously, this is a characteristic of the camera and not a consequence of the lens choice.
Okay, so if you're still with me, follow me to Randall's Island to shoot decks when he does his weekly goalie training. Training is after dark and under floodlights. My objective, again, was to see how well the Tamron tracked him during his training sessions, especially at the longer focal lengths and under less than perfect lighting. The minimum aperture at 500mm is f6.7, which again forced ISOs up. I used ISO 25,600 for a number of the sequences, and while this doesn't make for the cleanest images, they are still pretty usable. But it also went to show that the lens on the Z8 was reliable and predictable in its ability to follow the action in lower light.
So if you've stuck around this long, I think you'll get the sense that I'm really happy with the autofocusing capabilities of the lens and with the lens overall. Specifically regarding the Tamron's autofocusing capabilities, I'm pleased with the speed of the acquisition of focus and the ability to maintain focus on a variety of moving subjects. So the Tamron 150 to 500 is pretty much exactly what I hoped it would be. Compact, decently sharp, with reliable autofocus, and for a very reasonable price. While I did find an issue with using EVR when shooting video on the Tamron 150 to 500 on the Nikon Z8 body, and while I think that anecdotally the VR, the lens on regular Nikon bodies, isn't as good as first-party Nikon lenses, these points aren't sufficient to alter my overall opinion of the lens. Unlike my purchases of the Panasonic Leica 100 to 400mm and the Tamron 100 to 400 f-mount lenses, I feel the Tamron 150 to 500mm meet my requirements for a decently priced super telephoto lens. So that wraps up this video. If you have any questions or thoughts about this lens, please let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear them. Thanks for checking out the video, and if it's been helpful, please give a like and subscribe.